Biology is the study of life. So with that in mind, how do we define life? So for example, let's say we go and we explore Mars, and we find something on Mars that we have never seen before. How do we as scientists systematically determine whether the thing that we have discovered is alive or not? Well, based on what we know about life on Earth, we have 6 characteristics that something has to have in order to be considered alive. And those characteristics are, first of all, life is organized. The second is that life requires materials and energy. The third characteristic of life is that living organisms maintain homeostasis. The fourth characteristic of life is that living organisms respond. And we can add to this and say that living organisms respond to their environment and to other living organisms. The fifth characteristic of living things is that all living things reproduce and develop. And the sixth characteristic of all living things is that living organisms have adaptations. So you should know this list from memory. So you should know that these 6 characteristics are required in order for something to be considered alive. And on the next couple of pages, we're going to talk a little bit more about what each of these characteristics means and go into a little bit more detail. The first characteristic of life that we're going to talk about is that life is organized. And what we mean by that is that life is made up of structures that kind of build upon themselves from teeny tiny little atoms all the way up to basically the whole planet Earth and the universe. So starting out with what we know so far about how living organisms are made up, we know that all matter is made up of these things called atoms. So when it comes to life, all living things are made up of atoms. Now, non-living things are also made up of atoms. So this isn't necessarily just unique to living things, but this is kind of the smallest level of organization that we usually talk about. So we'll go ahead and write smallest and least complex. Now, atoms can bond together in order to form larger structures called molecules. And molecules can bond together to form larger structures called cells. And in some textbooks and some references, they might have an intermediate step between molecules and cells in which they would call organelles. Now, when cells connect together, they can form something called a tissue. Tissues can work together to form organs. Organs can work together to form organ systems. Organ systems can come together to form organisms. And a group of organisms of the same type of organism is called a population. Now, in between kind of this organism and population level, we have this kind of this term that you should know, which is species. Now, when you put populations together, you form communities. Communities interacting with their abiotic or non-living environmental factors form ecosystems. And then all of the ecosystems on Earth form the biosphere. And since we haven't definitively determined that there is life on other planets, at this point the biosphere is kind of the largest or most complex kind of level of organization of life. So let's go back and do a quick kind of definition of each of these terms and give an example. So as we mentioned, atoms are just the basic units of living and non-living matter. So an atom is just the smallest unit that can exist of an element. So when you think of atoms, you can think of elements, even though those two terms are not interchangeable, but they are related. So think about the elements on the periodic table. So examples of atoms are going to be things like carbon, nitrogen, oxygen, etc. Molecules are just made up of two or more atoms bonded together. And examples include things like oxygen. So O2 is the molecule, the type of oxygen that's in the air that you breathe. Things like carbon dioxide. Things like the nutrients that you eat, so things like glucose, proteins, etc. Organelles are structures that carry out specific functions for cells. And examples of organelles include things like mitochondria, the nucleus, the endoplasmic reticulum. We'll talk about these a lot more when we get to talking about cells a little bit later in the semester. Now, a cell is the smallest unit of life. And what we mean by that is the smallest living thing can be made up of one cell. So for example, a bacterium is made up of one cell, and that one cell has all of the characteristics needed in order for it to be considered alive. It also means that all living things are made up of cells. So if something's multicellular, it might be made up of more than one cell, but the cell is kind of that basic living unit of a living thing. Tissues are made up of two or more cells that work together to perform a function. In humans, some examples of tissues are epithelial tissue, muscle tissue, connective tissue, and nervous tissue. Organs are just two or more tissues that work together to perform a function. And examples of organs would be things like the stomach, the liver, the intestines, etc. An organ system is just made up of a group of organs And you're probably starting to see a trend here. So a group of organs that work together to perform a function. For example, the organs that I listed in the previous example, the stomach, the liver, and the intestines, are all part of the digestive system. An organism is an individual living thing. And technically at this level, we're talking about multicellular organisms. So you might want to give yourself a little note off to the side that this is multicellular. Multi meaning that it's made up of more than one cell. And the reason why I make that kind of designation is because remember we said that a cell is the smallest unit of life. So there are some organisms that are unicellular. Uni meaning one cell, such as bacteria. And so the unicellular organisms don't have tissues, organs, organ systems, et cetera, but they're still considered an organism. Now, a species, remember, is just a group of organisms that are able to interbreed. So it's kind of a classification of similar organisms that can breed, or what we mean by that is produce offspring, so produce more of themselves. A population is just a group of the same type of organism, so a group of same species or organisms interacting with each other. And what we mean by that is in order to be a population, there has to be some sort of interaction between the organisms in the population. Now, that's kind of an open-ended definition because, for example, let's talk about a population of humans. We could be talking about the population of one classroom. Or we could be talking about the population of a city, or the population of a county, or the population of a state, or a population of a country, or we could be talking about the population of the entire world. So it's a little bit arbitrary as to what that definition is of interacting with each other, and it kind of depends on how you're studying it. Now, communities are just made up of two or more populations interacting with each other. So an example of a community could be something like if you go to the beach and you look in the water, and in the water you have these invertebrate animals, and you have dolphins, and you have whales, and you have sharks, and you have people, and you have seagrasses, and you have all these different living things that each different type of organism is its own population, but they're interacting with each other. They're eating each other. They're transferring nutrients to each other. And that's what makes up a community. Now, an ecosystem is just a community interacting with the abiotic factors of the environment. And what we mean by abiotic, so you're going to see this show up quite a bit in biology and the sciences. Whenever you see the A in front of a word, it usually means without. And we know that bio means life. And so abiotic refers to non-living parts of the environment. And examples include things like water, air, soil, etc. And then the last kind of layer of organization is the biosphere. And the biosphere, we're just talking about all of the ecosystems on Earth. So we can just basically say Earth is the biosphere. One of the characteristics of life is that it requires materials and energy. And when we are referring to materials, we're really referring to nutrients. And nutrients are primarily just atoms in the form of molecules that we take into our body in order to make the chemicals that make up our body. So you've maybe heard the phrase that you are what you eat. And that is absolutely true because you are primarily made up of the elements carbon, oxygen, nitrogen, and hydrogen. So 96% of your biomass is made up of these four elements. And where does the carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, and the hydrogen come from that makes up you? The answer is that it comes from your food. So when you eat food, you're eating compounds and molecules that contain these atoms. And then your body is able to take these atoms or these compounds, break them down into their individual atoms and kind of smaller pieces and put them back together in order to make you. So the carbon atoms that are in your body right now were the carbon atoms that were in your hamburger maybe a couple days ago. Now, when referring to energy, energy by definition is just the ability to do work. And so in living organisms, they need energy for things like reproduction, growth, movement, etc., etc. And where does this energy come from? So ultimately, all of the energy, or the vast majority of the energy on Earth, comes from the sun. And if you haven't done so lately, you should go hug a tree or thank a plant, because plants are these amazing organisms that have the ability to take energy from the sun and capture that energy. And then when another organism comes along and eats that plant, it can actually take the energy that originally came from the sun and was stored in the plant, and it now gets incorporated into the other organism. For example, when you eat a hamburger, so let's talk about the ground beef in the hamburger. You are eating an animal and you are taking the energy from the cow that's in that beef. Now, the energy in that beef came from the grass that the cow ate, and the energy in the grass came from the sun through this process known as photosynthesis. So you will learn that essentially living organisms are really just borrowing energy and nutrients for an amount of time. So think about you as a human. You are taking nutrients and energy from other organisms. And we typically think of humans as being at the top of the food chain. So we're getting all this energy and all these nutrients and compounds and atoms from these other organisms, and we're incorporating them into our body. But eventually, someday, you're going to die. And when you die, your body is going to decompose. And what happens is that all of those nutrients, so all of those atoms and all of those molecules and all that energy is actually going to be recycled back into the environment. So there are different organisms called decomposers that are going to break down those compounds and release that energy to be used by other organisms. So really you're just borrowing the carbon, the oxygen, the nitrogen, the hydrogen, and the energy until you don't need it anymore, and then it's going to become another living organism. All living organisms have the ability to maintain homeostasis. And if we break down this word homeostasis, we can look at kind of the two roots that make up the word. Homeo means same, and stasis means to stay. So the word homeostasis means to stay the same. And the definition, if we kind of write it out, is just the ability of an organism and I'm going to add or system because homeostasis can also be maintained by ecosystems. So the ability of an organism or system to maintain relatively stable conditions despite a constantly changing environment. Now, I'm not going to go into a lot of detail in this video about homeostasis because I have an entire other presentation that covers just this concept of homeostasis and how it is maintained. So make sure you check out the other video to better understand this concept of homeostasis and how living organisms maintain homeostasis. Another characteristic of all living things is that they respond. And I added the qualifier here that they respond to the environment and or to each other. Now, when we refer to the response of an organism, we're talking about things like maintaining homeostasis. So we talked about that on a previous slide. But basically, in order for an organism to maintain homeostasis, it has to sense the environment and then do something in response to a change in the environment. So we'll just say response to a change in the environment. For example, if the temperature in the environment increases, the body responds by sweating in order to maintain the normal body temperature. Other ways that living organisms respond often involves movement. So not always, but often involves movement. Or we can even kind of say behaviors. So think about the fact that organisms have to search for food. We'll say search and compete for food. Remember that food is where living organisms obtain nutrients and energy. Organisms also have to have behaviors for things like finding mates for reproduction. Things like communication. Things like hunting and defense. So these are all examples of ways that organisms respond to something that's going on in their environment or responding to behaviors by other individuals in their environment. All living organisms have the ability to reproduce and develop. So by reproduce, basically what we mean is the ability to make more of itself. So make more organisms like self. So all life comes from life. So living things give birth to other living things or produce other living things. You can't take something that's not alive and turn it into something that is alive. Now, there are different types of reproduction. So there's sexual reproduction, which requires sex cells. And the most familiar sex cells the sex cells that you're probably most familiar with are just going to be eggs and sperm. There's also asexual reproduction. And remember that in science, typically when you see an A in front of the word, it means without. So asexual reproduction refers to reproduction without the use of sex cells. And an example of asexual reproduction would be like binary fission, which is one way that bacteria reproduce. Now, when we're referring to developing, we're referring to a change in an individual over time. So this includes things like growth and also just physical changes. So think about when you were born. So when I was born, I weighed about 8.5 pounds and I didn't have any hair. And I look very different than I do today. So I can guarantee you, even though you can't see me on this video, I weigh more than 8.5 pounds and I have hair now. So I changed over time. And the concept or the driving force behind development is actually gene regulation. And we'll talk about that much later in the course. But basically, you have different genes that get turned on and off during development. And depending on which genes are on and which ones are off depends on ultimately what you develop into. So think about, for example, puberty. So there are a lot of physical changes that happen during puberty, and those physical changes are due to genes that were previously not active becoming active due to different cellular signals in your body through hormones and neurotransmitters and stuff like that. Another characteristic of all living things is that they have adaptations, and adaptations are modifications that make organisms better able to function in a particular environment. Modifications occur due to genetic variations in the population. And these variations come from mutations. Now, these mutations or variations allow for evolution to occur. And the biological definition of evolution is change in a population over time. Now, don't confuse this with development. Remember, on a previous slide, we looked at the fact that all living things develop, and we said that development was change in an individual over time. And evolution is driven by a process known as natural selection. So, natural selection and evolution are not the same thing, but they do go hand in hand. They are related to each other. So, natural selection is the process that allows or causes evolution to occur.